The small lamp on the table threw more shadow than light. Mae Sutton sat across from the man she had known for less than a month, her fingers pressed flat against the worn wood of the table, like she was trying to hold the whole surface down. Outside, the wind was tearing itself apart against the cabin walls, rattling the shutters, pushing cold through every crack. But inside, the room felt thick and perfectly still, the way air feels before something breaks. She had been carrying this moment in her chest for 3 weeks. She had rehearsed it at the water pump, rehearsed it while splitting wood, rehearsed it in the dark while staring at the ceiling with her hands folded over her ribs. She had always known it would come. The only question was whether she would speak first or wait for him to find out on his own. She chose to speak first. And that was the one thing she could still control. "I'm no virgin," she said. Her voice came out thin and unsteady, like a thread pulled too tight. She did not look at him when she said it. She looked at the grain of the table, at the old ring left by a coffee cup, at her own knuckles going pale from the pressure of her hands. Then she waited. She knew the look that was coming. She had seen it before, more than once. The way a man's face shifts when he decides a woman has lost something that can't be given back. The eyes go flat, the jaw tightens. And just like that, you stop being a person to him and become a problem he wants no part of. She waited for Cade Rourke's face to do that. It didn't. He sat completely still across from her, the lamplight catching the edge of his jaw, his eyes steady on her face. Not hard, not soft either. He just present, like he was listening to every word she hadn't said yet. That stillness scared her more than anger would have. She pressed her hands harder into the table and made herself hold the silence, because she had learned a long time ago that filling silence with more words was how a woman talked herself into a corner she couldn't get out of. The wind screamed outside. The lamp flame shivered. Cade opened his mouth to answer her. And everything that came next would either push her out into that cold, howling night or change the entire shape of her life. But to understand what this moment meant, to really feel the weight of it, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to Redwood Flats. The town sat at the edge of pine country, where the trees thinned out and the earth turned the color of dried blood. And the air always carried the smell of hot resin and dust. And in the summer, the sun pressed down on everything with the kind of patience that felt almost personal, like it had decided long ago to see exactly how much this particular stretch of land could take. Mae Sutton's ranch sat at the far end of Redwood Flats, where the tree line started and the shadows ran long in the afternoon. It was not a pretty ranch. The gate had been sagging on one hinge for 2 seasons. The porch boards creaked in the wrong places. The well rope had frayed down to its last reliable inch. But every inch of it was hers, or it had been her father's, which in Mae's mind was close enough to the same thing. She had been running it alone for 4 years. You could see the work in her hands before you saw anything else about her. They were not soft hands. The skin at her knuckles had cracked and healed and cracked again so many times that it had given up being smooth. Her palms had calluses where the axe handle sat. She wore her dark hair pulled back while she worked, not because she cared about keeping it tidy, but because she could not afford to have it in her face while she was doing something that required both eyes and all her attention. She did not mind hard work. Hard work was honest. It gave the day a shape and the night a reason to sleep. What she minded was everything else. She minded the letter sitting on her kitchen table, the one from the First Territorial Bank of Redwood Flats, written in the careful handwriting of a man who had never once worried about where his next meal was coming from. 30 days. That was what the letter said. The 30 days to produce the full amount of the debt her father had left behind, or the bank would move to claim the property under the terms of the original land agreement. 30 days. She had read it so many times the paper was starting to go soft at the folds. She also minded Silas Thorne. Thorne owned the largest spread in the county, a cattle operation that ran from the river all the way to the North Ridge. He wore suits that cost more than Mae's monthly earnings and smiled at people with his mouth while his eyes stayed busy calculating. He had been making offers on her land since the 2nd year she was on it. Polite offers at first, delivered by letter, then less polite ones, delivered in person, with 2 of his men standing just far enough behind him to be deniable. Mae had turned down everyone. She did not trust Thorne. She did not trust men who smiled that much. But now the bank was involved, and the bank had the law behind it, and Mae was running out of room to stand her ground on nothing but stubbornness and the memory of her father's voice telling her that land was the only thing worth fighting for. She was at the water pump one morning, 3 weeks before the bank's deadline, when she heard a horse come through the main gate. She did not reach for the rifle leaning against the pump post. Not yet. She straightened up and turned to look, one hand still on the pump handle, water dripping from her wrist into the dust. The man on the horse was not anyone she recognized. He was lean in the way that comes from years of outdoor work rather than going without. There was no hollowness in his face, just a kind of economy to him. Like nothing on his body was there by accident. His coat was trail-worn. His hat had been through weather. He pulled his horse to a stop at a distance that was respectful without being timid, and looked at her the way almost no one in Redwood Flats ever had. He looked at her like she was a person standing on her own dirt. Not a target, not a widow in waiting, not a problem to be absorbed into someone else's plan. Just a woman on her own land, doing her own work. Mae did not know what to do with that look. It made her more nervous than if he had ridden in with his hand on his gun. Old Miller, whose property ran along the south fence line and who had a deep and well-documented suspicion of everyone who had ever existed, was mending wire along the fence line when the stranger rode in. Mae watched the old man glance up. She studied the stranger for a long moment and then give a single slow nod. The kind of nod Miller gave to maybe 4 people on Earth. Mae filed that away. "You looking for work?" she asked. Her voice came out flat and businesslike, which was exactly how she intended it. The stranger looked around the yard slowly, at the sagging gate, the split wood stacked unevenly against the barn wall, the wheel on the water cart that was sitting at the wrong angle. He looked at all of it the way a man looks at a problem he is already solving in his head. Then he looked back at her. "I'm looking for somewhere to be useful," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "Looks like you've got more than enough of that." Mae studied him for another moment. She had learned to read men quickly, out of necessity. She looked for the hunger, the kind that had nothing to do with food, and the impatience, and the particular quality of stillness in a man who was waiting for the right moment to show you who he really was. She did not find any of those things in Cade Rourke. What she found instead was harder to name. Something settled. Something that had been tested and had not broken, even if it had bent. "Room and board," she said finally. "No pay until the books improve. You leave when I say leave, no argument." "Agreed," he said. He stepped down from his horse, looped the reins over the fence post, and walked straight to the sagging gate. He did not ask where the tools were. He found them. Mae watched him work for a moment, just a moment, then turned back to the pump. She told herself she was not relieved. She told herself it was just good sense to have another pair of hands. She told herself a lot of things that first morning. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're watching this from today. Drop your city in the comments right now. I want to see exactly how far this story is reaching. And if you haven't subscribed to Redwood Chronicles yet, hit that button and turn on the notification bell, because this story is only getting started, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Cade Rourke did not talk much in those first few days. That suited Mae fine. She had no interest in a man who needed to fill every quiet moment with the sound of his own voice. She had known enough of those. Men who mistook loudness for strength and silence for weakness. Cade was neither loud nor weak. He simply worked. And he worked the way a man works when he is not doing it to impress anyone. The gate was the first thing. He spent the better part of that first morning on it, crouched in the dirt with the hinge spread out in pieces beside him, studying each component the way a doctor studies a wound before deciding how to treat it. Mae passed him twice on her way between the barn and the well. She did not stop to check on his progress. She did not need to. By midday, the gate swung clean and level on both hinges. The kind of smooth that meant he had not just fixed the obvious problem, but had found the one underneath it too. He did not mention it. He did not stand back and wait for her to notice and say something. He just moved on to the next thing, which was the split in the barn wall that had been letting weather in since February. Mae noticed. She said nothing either. That was, she realized, the beginning of a kind of unspoken agreement between them. By the third day, she had stopped watching the yard every time she heard him moving around. That was not a small thing. For 4 years, every unfamiliar sound on her property had put her hand somewhere near a weapon or a door. The habit had worn itself into her so deep she barely noticed it anymore. The way you stop noticing a scar after enough time has passed. But on the third morning, she heard the sound of him working the stuck barn latch, and her hand stayed where it was, resting on the kitchen windowsill, holding her coffee. She noticed the absence of the reflex. She did not examine it too closely. On the fourth day, a grain trader named Purvis came through. He was a round, sweating man with a cart and a practiced look of deep personal sorrow that he put on whenever he was about to tell someone the price had gone up. He had been cheating Mae on grain weight for the better part of 2 seasons, and they both knew it, but Mae had never been able to prove it cleanly enough to make the argument stick without Purvis walking away offended and cutting off her supply entirely. She was standing at the cart, looking at the numbers Purvis had scratched onto his ledger page, when she heard Cade come up behind her. He did not say much. He stepped up beside her, looked at the ledger, and then looked at Purvis with an expression that was not threatening. It was simply very, very clear, like a sky with no cloud cover, like a man who had already calculated exactly how this conversation was going to end and had all the time in the world to wait for Purvis to get there too. He said 2 words. Mae did not catch them. They were spoken too quietly, but she watched Purvis's face go through 4 distinct expressions in about 3 seconds, landing finally on a pinched, reluctant kind of acceptance. The man scratched out his original number, wrote a new one, and left without his usual parting speech about the difficulty of the trading life. Mae looked at the new number on the ledger. It was what the grain had always been worth. She looked at Cade. He was already walking back toward the barn. "And what did you say to him?" she asked. He paused without turning around. "Just reminded him that I used to work for the county land office," he said. "Told him I still know the weights inspector personally." He went back to work. Mae stood by the empty cart for a moment, looking at the corrected number, feeling something she did not immediately have a name for. It was close to gratitude, but it had an edge to it. The edge that comes when someone does for you the thing you have been trying to do for yourself for 2 years and makes it look easy. She went back inside and put the ledger away. The evenings were harder. During the day, there was always enough work to keep the distance between them practical and justifiable. But in the evenings after supper, when the light went gold and the pine trees threw long shadows across the yard, there was nothing left to do but exist in the same space. Mae usually sat on the porch steps with whatever mending needed doing. Cade usually found a place nearby, the fence rail, the bottom step, the edge of the water trough, and sat quietly with his coffee until dark pushed them both inside. They talked sometimes, small things at first, the condition of the north pasture fence, whether the roan mare was favoring her left foreleg, the price of cedar at the mill in town. The kind of talk that was really just two people learning the shape of each other's sentences without committing to anything larger. One evening, about a week in, Mae was on the porch mending a bridle when Cade looked at the way her shoulders were sitting, high and tight, drawn up toward her ears in the particular way that meant she was braced for something. "Hour, you're waiting for a blow that isn't coming," he said quietly. Mae's hand stopped moving. The words landed somewhere precise, the way an arrow lands when someone actually knows how to shoot. Not cruel. There was no cruelty in his voice, but accurate in a way that felt almost indecent, like he had reached into a part of her she kept the door closed on and simply described what he saw there. She felt heat move up the back of her neck. "Mind your horses," she said. The words came out harder than she intended. "And your own business while you're at it." She expected pushback. She was ready for it. Had her next 3 sentences already lined up, each one a little sharper than the last. Cade nodded once, stood up, and went back to the barn. No argument, no wounded silence, no pointed look over his shoulder, just gone. Mae sat on the porch steps alone, the bridle in her lap, and felt foolish in a way she had not felt in years. Not because she had been unkind to men who deserved far worse, but because he had not chased her reaction, and that meant he had not needed anything from it. He had said the thing because it was true, and when she shut the door on it, he had simply let her. She was not used to that. The second week settled into a rhythm that Mae noticed with the same quiet alarm she had noticed the missing reflex on the third morning. They moved around each other in the barn the way two people move when they have stopped calculating the space between them. She would reach for a brush and find he had already set it where her hand was going. He would start on the near horse and she would take the far one, without either of them deciding to split the work that way. It was just the most efficient thing, and they both saw it at the same time. The silence between them changed quality. It was the same silence, technically. Neither of them talked more than before, but it had stopped feeling like a held breath and started feeling like something else. The way a room feels when you have finally put the furniture in the right places and stopped having to think about where things are. Mae did not like how much she noticed it. She had built her life for 4 years on the principle that noticing things like that led nowhere good. She had been proven right once already, in a way she was not going to think about right now. Even in a way that had left her with a wall inside her chest so carefully constructed that she sometimes forgot there had ever been anything behind it. One evening, as they sat by the small fire outside after a long day of clearing brush from the upper pasture, Cade spoke about where he came from. He did not make it dramatic. He talked the way a man talks about something he has made his peace with. Not happily, but honestly, the way you describe a scar you have stopped being ashamed of. He had grown up in Kansas. He had made a mistake when he was 22. Not a criminal one, but the kind that cost you the people who trusted you. He had spent the years since then moving, working, putting distance between himself and a version of himself he did not want to be anymore. "I know what it feels like," he said, looking at the fire. "God, to carry something you didn't choose and have people decide that's all you are." Mae looked at the side of his face in the firelight. She wanted to say something dismissive, something that would put the right amount of distance back between them, restore the clean professional space she had been careful to maintain. Instead, she said nothing, because the truth was she knew exactly what he meant. She knew the particular weight of it, the way it sits between your shoulder blades and never fully lets you stand straight. She had been carrying her own version of that weight for 7 years, and she had never once heard someone describe it so plainly without making it sound like a confession that required a response. He was not asking her for anything. He was just telling her the truth. Mae looked back at the fire and felt the hairline crack she had been ignoring for days run a little deeper through the wall she'd spent 7 years building. She told herself it was just the cold. She told herself she was just tired. She pulled her coat tighter and watched the fire burn down. "I have to stop here for just a second, because I need to know if you're feeling what I'm feeling right now. These two people are dancing around something enormous, and neither of them is ready to name it yet. If you're rooting for Mae and Cade, give this video a thumbs up right now. And tell me in the comments, do you think Mae is going to let that wall come down, or is she going to find a way to push him out before he gets too close? I read every single comment. Let me know." And the sound of Silas Thorne's carriage always announced itself before the man did. It was the wheels. Expensive iron-rimmed wheels that rang against the hard dirt road with a particular kind of authority. The sound of a man who had never once in his life considered that he might be unwelcome somewhere. Mae heard it from inside the barn, where she was checking the roan mare's left foreleg, and she knew what it was before she straightened up. She took her time straightening up. She walked out of the barn at her own pace, wiping her hands on the rags she kept tucked in her belt, and stood in the middle of her yard as the carriage rolled through the gate that Cade had fixed 10 days ago. The gate swung smooth and easy, short, which somehow made Mae angrier than if it had still been broken, as though Thorne's carriage was benefiting from work it had no right to. Silas Thorne stepped down from the carriage the way he did everything, with a performance of effortlessness that was designed to make you feel the gap between his life and yours. His suit was charcoal gray and spotless despite the dust on every road between here and town. His boots were polished, his hat came off the moment he saw Mae, and he pressed it to his chest with a smile that started at his mouth and stopped cold before it reached his eyes. "Miss Sutton," he said. His voice was warm and measured, the voice of a man who had practiced sounding reasonable for so long it had become second nature. "I hope I'm not interrupting your morning." "You are," Mae said. "What do you want?" "Cade Thorne." Something moved behind his eyes. Not anger, not quite. More like a filing away. He put his hat back on and reached into his coat. "I've come as a courtesy," he said, producing a folded document and holding it out toward her. Before things become formal, Mae did not take the papers from his hand. She waited until he set them on the fence post between them, and then she picked them up herself. She unfolded them slowly, reading each line with the careful attention of someone who has learned, at real cost, that the dangerous part is always in the middle of a document, never at the top or bottom where your eyes naturally go first. It was all there. The full amount of the debt, written out to the penny, which was a deliberate choice, because round numbers feel negotiable and exact numbers feel like law. The date, the 14th. The terms, full payment by sunset, or the First Territorial Bank of Redwood Flats would exercise its right to claim the property under the original land agreement her father had signed 11 years ago, before Mae was old enough to understand what he was putting his name on. She read it twice. Then she folded it back along its original creases and held it at her side. 30 days was the agreement, she said. 30 days from the date of the notice, Thorne said pleasantly. The notice was delivered 18 days ago, Miss Sutton. I believe you've had some time to consider your options. He let that sit for a moment, then tilted his head in the practiced manner of a man about to offer you a gift. I want you to know, he said, that my offer still stands. Full settlement of the debt. An immediate transfer of title, and I will personally ensure you have a position on the property for as long as you want one. A good position. You know this land better than anyone. That has value to me. Mae looked at him. She looked at the two men who had ridden in behind the carriage and were now sitting their horses just inside the gate, not doing anything threatening, just being present in the way large dogs are present. A reminder, in case you had forgotten, that teeth exist. Your offer, Mae said, is the same thing it's always been. You want my land, and you want me to thank you for taking it. Thorne's smile did not waver. I want you to be practical, he said. A woman alone, running a property this size with a debt this size, there's no shame in recognizing when a situation has run its course. He said it kindly. That was the worst part. He said it in the voice of a man doing her a favor. Mae opened her mouth to answer him. She did not get the chance. Cade Rourke stepped out from the shadow of the porch. He did not come out fast or loud. He walked out the way he did everything, at his own pace, with that particular quality of stillness that Mae had stopped being able to ignore. He came and stood beside her, close enough that his shoulder was almost touching hers, and he looked at Thorne with an expression that was completely empty of hostility and therefore somehow worse than a direct threat. She isn't alone, Cade said. His voice was conversational, like he was discussing the weather. And this land isn't for sale. Thorne looked at Cade for a long moment, his eyes doing their busy calculating work. He looked at the way Cade stood. He looked at the set of his hands. He looked for the thing that would tell him who this man was and whether he needed to be accounted for. He did not find a clean answer, and Mae could see that bothered him. I don't believe we've met, Thorne said. No, Cade agreed. We haven't. The silence that followed was not comfortable for anyone except Cade, who appeared to find it perfectly acceptable. Thorne put his hat back on, smoothed the front of his coat, and looked back at Mae. The 14th, Miss Sutton, he said. I genuinely hope you'll make the right decision before then. He said it the way a man says something he intends you to hear as a warning, while being able to later claim it was only advice. He climbed back into his carriage. His two men turned their horses without being told. The iron wheels rang against the hard dirt as the carriage rolled back out through the gate, and then the sound faded into the tree line, and the yard went quiet. Mae stood in the middle of her property and watched the dust settle. Her heart was hammering against her ribs with the force of something that wanted badly to be panic, and that she was refusing, through the sheer pressure of her will, to become panic. She ran the numbers in her head the way she had been running them every morning for 3 weeks. The extra horses, she could sell 2, maybe 3, but the market was soft and she would not get close to what they were worth. More work in town. There was nothing available that paid enough, and she could not leave the ranch unattended long enough to matter. No old Miller. She had already dismissed that option because Miller's help always came with conditions attached that created new problems while solving old ones. Every door she pushed on swung back and hit her. She was still standing in the yard, the folded document in her hand, when Cade spoke. How much? He asked quietly. More than I have, she said. How much more? She told him the number. He was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of a man who has run out of ideas, more the quiet of a man rearranging what he knows into a new shape. "The High Valley," he said. "Those cedar stands your father marked on the survey map. You said the timber rights were still yours." "They are," Mae said slowly. "But getting it to the mill takes time," he said. "Which you have." "Barely." He looked at her. "But you have it." Mae looked out at the tree line, toward the high valley she had not walked in 2 years because it hurt to be up there, where her father had spent so much of his time and left so many of his footprints in the dirt. She thought about the cedar, tall, straight-grained cedar that the mill in town paid a premium for. She thought about the number Thorne had written out to the penny. It was possible, if everything went right, if the weather held and the horses held and nothing went wrong, that could not be fixed in the same day it broke. Everything going right was not something Mae Sutton had a long history with, but she looked at the folded document in her hand, and she looked at the gate swinging easy on its oiled hinges, and she thought about Cade standing at her shoulder without being asked, and she felt something she had been careful not to feel for a very long time. She felt like maybe the odds were not entirely against her. "We'd need to start tomorrow," she said. "I know," Cade said. "Before sunrise." "I'll be ready." Mae folded the document one more time and put it in her coat pocket. She did not say thank you. She did not have the words for what she would have been thanking him for, which was not just the plan, but the fact of him. The fact of him standing there like he had already decided some time ago that her fight was worth fighting. She walked back toward the barn. Behind her, she heard him go back to work. He just chose to stand in the line of fire when he had every reason to stay out of it. Every single reason. If you think Mae finally has someone worth trusting in her corner, hit that like button right now. And I need you to tell me in the comments. Do you think they can actually pull this off before the 14th? Because Thorne is not the kind of man who shows up once and walks away quietly. I'm already worried about what he's going to do next. Are you? They started before the sky had any color in it. Mae was already at the barn when Cade came in from the bunkhouse, his breath making small clouds in the cold, dark air. Neither of them said good morning. There was no need for it. The horses needed harnessing, the wagon needed loading with the tools, and the trail up to the high valley was steep enough that they needed to be on it before the ground softened in the afternoon heat. Words would have just been in the way. That was the thing about working alongside Cade Rourke that Mae had stopped being able to pretend she did not notice. He understood the grammar of work, the unspoken language of when to move and when to be still, when to push and when to let a thing rest. Most men she had worked with talked too much, or not enough, or at the wrong times. Cade talked exactly the right amount, which some mornings was not at all. They loaded the wagon in the dark and were on the trail as the first gray light came up over the eastern ridge. The high valley was everything Mae remembered, and a few things she had not let herself think about. It sat above the main ranch like a secret the land was keeping. A long, sheltered stretch of ground running between two ridges, where the cedar grew thick and straight, the trunks so clean and pale they almost glowed in the early morning light. Her father had loved it up here. He used to say the high valley was where the land showed you what it was capable of when nobody was bothering it. Mae had not been up here since the spring before he died. She stepped off the wagon and stood for a moment, not doing anything, just looking at the trees. The air was different up here, cooler and carrying the deep. The clean smell of cedar resin that settled at the back of the throat like something medicinal. Cade did not ask her if she was all right. He stepped down from the wagon, pulled the axe from the tool bed, and walked to the nearest tree to assess it. He ran his hand along the bark the way you run your hand along a wall to find the studs, methodically, reading what was underneath. He marked 3 trees with a notch before Mae shook herself loose from whatever she had been standing in and went to get her own axe. Work was the cure. It always had been. The days that followed had a quality that Mae had no category for, and therefore tried not to think about too carefully. They rose before light. They worked the valley through the morning, felling and limbing and cutting the cedar into mill lengths. When the sound of axes and the crack of falling timber filling the valley from first light until the heat of midday made the uphill work genuinely dangerous. In the afternoons, they drove the first loads down the trail and stacked them in the yard, the pale cedar piling up in rows that smelled so strongly it reached Mae in the kitchen while she was cooking supper. The pile grew every day. Mae watched it grow with a feeling she did not trust, a bright, cautious thing in her chest that she kept waiting to be disappointed. She had learned not to count on things that were going right, because in her experience, things that were going right were usually just setting up for the particular kind of fall that hurt the most. But the weather held, the horses held, and the cedar was straight-grained and valuable, and there was more of it than she had remembered. And Cade was there. Every morning, every hour of the long days. It was on the fifth day, during a short rest by the creek that ran along the bottom of the North Ridge, that something shifted between them in a way Mae felt before she understood. They were crouched by the water, rinsing the morning's work from their faces, the creek cold enough to ache. Mae was scrubbing the cedar dust from her forearms when Cade, looking at the water, said something about the roan mare. Some observation about the way the horse favored shade over water when she was hot, which was backwards from every other horse he had ever worked with, and he said it in a way that was genuinely puzzled. Totally like the mare had presented him with a philosophical problem he could not stop turning over. Mae laughed. It came out before she could decide whether to let it. A real laugh. Not polite, not managed, but the kind that comes from somewhere below the chest and surprises you with its own existence. She laughed at the expression on his face, at the complete seriousness with which he had delivered a question about a horse's preference for shade, at the absurdity of laughing at all when the deadline was 9 days away and the pile in the yard was not yet big enough. Cade looked at her, startled, and then he smiled. It was the first time she had seen him smile with his whole face. Not the small, private thing he did sometimes when he thought she was not looking, but an actual smile that reached all the way up and changed the shape of his eyes. Mae looked away first. She looked back at the water and finished rinsing her arms, and she was aware, with a precision that felt almost clinical, that the space between them had not changed. They were the same distance apart they had been 30 seconds ago. But something in it had. The air between them had stopped being neutral. It had become the kind of air that has a temperature that you can feel on your skin when the angle changes. Neither of them mentioned it. They stood up, dried their hands, and went back to work. But for the rest of that afternoon, Mae was aware of exactly where he was in the valley at every moment, the way you are aware of a sound that has stopped. Not because anything had gone wrong, but because the silence where it used to be had a shape of its own now. That night, sitting by the small fire they built at the edge of the yard after supper, Cade was quiet for a long time in a different way than his usual quiet. There was something in it, a weight, a gathering. Mae noticed it the way she noticed weather coming. She waited. "I need to tell you something," he said finally. He was looking at the fire. "About why I'm still here." Mae set down her coffee cup. "You don't owe me an explanation." "I know," he said. "I want to give you one anyway." He was quiet for another moment. Then he looked at her, and his eyes in the firelight were very steady, the way they always were, but with something underneath the steadiness that Mae had not seen there before. Something that had the quality of a door being opened from the inside. "I ran away from my life," he said. "Not from the law, not from a debt, from the person I was when things went wrong. From the look on people's faces when they'd made up their minds about who I was based on the worst thing I'd ever done." He paused. "I've been moving for 3 years, telling myself I was just working, telling myself I'd stop somewhere when it felt right." Mae did not say anything. She held the silence carefully, the way you hold something fragile. "I didn't plan to stay here," he said. "The first week, I told myself I'd move on once I'd done enough to feel square. But then," he stopped, looked back at the fire. "I watched you run this place. I watched the way you fight for it. And I realized I was watching someone doing the thing I had stopped believing was possible. Staying. Standing in one place and refusing to let it be taken." He looked at her again. "I didn't stay for the work," he said. "I stayed because I saw someone fighting the same shadows I am. And I wanted to remember what that looked like, what it felt like to be near someone who hadn't given up yet." The fire cracked and settled. Mae felt the thing in her chest. The wall, the careful architecture of 7 years of keeping herself contained, develop a crack that was longer and deeper than any that had come before. Not breaking, not yet, But the kind of crack that changes the structural integrity of a thing, the kind you cannot simply fill back in and pretend was never there. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she picked up her coffee cup, looked back at the fire and said very quietly, "I haven't given up." "I know," Cade said. "That's why I stayed." They sat by the fire until it burned down to coals, not saying anything else, the night settling around them like a blanket, the cedar-smelling air moving softly through the yard, and the pile of timber standing in clean, pale rows against the barn wall. 9 days of work left, and for the first time in 4 years, Mae Sutton did not feel entirely alone inside her own life. She told herself that was enough. She told herself not to want more than that. She was not entirely sure she believed herself. I have to be honest with you. This is the part of the story that gets me every time. Two people who have been carrying their damage alone for years, finally close enough to feel the weight of someone else's. If this story is hitting you the way it's hitting me, this is the moment to subscribe if you haven't yet, because I put everything into these stories. Every word, every beat. And the only way I can keep making them is if you're here. Hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments, do you think Mae is ready to let someone in? Or is she going to find a reason to pull back before this gets too real? The bridge was gone, not damaged, not weakened by weather or worn down by the kind of slow neglect that takes years to show its full cost. Gone, hacked apart at the support beams and burned, the charred remains of the timber dropping into the water in black pieces. Sorry, the smell of smoke still sitting over the river like something that refused to leave the scene of what it had done. Mae stood on the bank and looked at it. She had been looking at it for perhaps 2 minutes, which felt both like no time at all and like a very long time, the way time behaves when your mind is working too hard to let the rest of you catch up. The morning light was flat and pale on the water. The current moved around the burned wreckage with the indifference of something that has been running long enough to have stopped caring what falls into it. Cade stood beside her, a little back, giving her the space of a person who understands that some moments need to be absorbed before they can be spoken about. Behind them, on the wrong side of the water, sat 11 days of work. The cedar, pale, straight-grained, my valuable cedar that smelled like the inside of her father's memory, was stacked in careful rows on the far bank where they had staged it for the final haul. Ready, waiting. On the wrong side of a river that now had no crossing, 4 days before the deadline, that would decide whether Mae Sutton kept her land or lost it to a man in a charcoal suit who had never done a single day of honest work in his life. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that Thorne would not simply wait. She had known it, and she had pushed the knowledge down because there was no room for it. No room to plan for sabotage while you were already working at the outer edge of what was physically possible. She had told herself that Thorne would not move against her openly, that he had lawyers and documents and the law's backing, and that men like Thorne preferred their victories to look like inevitability rather than crime. She had been wrong. Men like Thorne burned bridges when they thought no one would trace the fire back to them. Men like Thorne sent hands out in the night to do the ugly work and came to town the next morning with clean clothes and plausible ignorance. Men like Thorne had been winning for so long that they had stopped worrying about what their winning looked like. Mae bent down and picked up a piece of charred wood from the bank. She turned it over in her hands. The cut at the end was clean, made with an axe, not burned through. Someone had hacked the supports first and then set the fire. That was deliberate work, patient work, the kind of work a man does when he wants to make sure the message is unmistakable. She set the piece of wood back down on the bank. She straightened up. She did not cry. She had not cried in front of anyone in 7 years, and she was not going to start now. Not here, not for Silas Thorne. But something inside her gave way. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet, total completeness of a thing that has been holding on past the point where holding on makes sense and has finally, simply let go. She dropped her axe into the dirt. She sat down on a stump at the edge of the bank, her elbows on her knees, her face in her hands, and she stopped. Not crying, not screaming, just stopped. The way a clock stops when the mechanism that has been driving it finally runs out of tension. She was not the tough woman of Redwood Flats in this moment. She was not the hard-working rancher or the woman who had turned down Silas Thorne 3 times without blinking. She was just Mae, A woman who was 31 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the 11 days of timber work and everything to do with the 7 years before it. The 7 years of holding herself together through the force of pure refusal, of being so afraid that if she stopped moving, she would find out that the thing she was running from had already caught her. She was tired of fighting a world that seemed to have decided, a long time ago, that she was not worth protecting. Cade did not try to fix it. He walked over, sat down on the grass near her feet, and said nothing. He did not put a hand on her shoulder or offer her words that were really just his own discomfort dressed up as comfort. He just sat there close enough that she could feel the warmth of another person in the cold morning air, and he let her be in it. They stayed like that for a long time. The river moved. A bird somewhere in the pines made a sound, and then stopped. The smoke smell drifted. Then Cade spoke. He spoke quietly, looking out at the water, and what he said was not about the bridge or the timber or the deadline. It was about himself. He had been holding something back. Mae had known it. The way you know when a room has a door you have not been shown yet. And now, sitting on the bank of a burned-out crossing with 4 days left on the clock, he opened it. He told her he was not just a drifter passing through ranch country looking for work. He had been a deputy once, in a county 2 states east of here, a place he had not spoken the name of to anyone in 3 years. He had been good at the work. He had believed in it. And then he had made a decision, not a corrupt one, not a dishonest one, but a decision made in a fast moment with incomplete information that had cost a man his reputation and cost Cade everything that came with the badge. He had resigned before they could take it from him. He had saddled his horse the next morning and ridden west and had not written a letter or sent a word back to anyone who had known him before. "I thought I was too stained," he said. "That's the word I used to myself. Stained. Like something had gotten into me that wouldn't wash out. And the kindest thing I could do for anyone was to take it somewhere far away and keep it to myself." He looked at her then. "And I didn't stay on this ranch because I needed the work," he said. "I stayed because watching you fight for something you love made me remember what it felt like to love something enough to fight for it. I had forgotten that. I think I had been trying to forget it on purpose." Mae lifted her face from her hands. She looked at him in the flat morning light, this man who had ridden in through her gate 3 weeks ago and fixed her hinges and faced down a grain trader and stood at her shoulder when Thorne came calling, and she felt the crack in the wall inside her chest widen in a way that frightened her with its finality. She had 2 choices left. She had been running the arithmetic since the moment she saw the burned bridge, turning the options over with the same mechanical precision she used on the bank ledger. She could walk into Thorne's office before the 14th and sign over the title. He would give her a position on the property. He had offered it, and men like Thorne kept their small promises because breaking them would cost more than keeping them. She would have a roof. She would have work. She would be an employee on her father's land, moving through rooms that used to belong to her, watching Thorne's men run the ranch she had bled for. Or she could pack what she could carry, walk away from the only place that had ever felt like the ground beneath her feet, rather than something she was passing through, and become a ghost on the trail again. No land, no name worth anything, no fixed point on the map of her own life. Both choices felt like a kind of dying. She sat on the stump at the edge of the ruined crossing and felt the full weight of it settle onto her shoulders, and for a long moment she let it sit there. She did not fight it. She did not try to reframe it or find the angle that made it survivable. She just felt it. And then she looked at Cade, who was still sitting in the grass near her feet, who had told her the truth about himself at the worst possible moment because he had decided she deserved the truth. And she opened her mouth and let 7 years out. She told him about the night she lost her innocence. She told him about the man who had taken it, not a stranger, not a random violence from the dark, but someone she had trusted, which was the part that had done the most lasting damage, the part that had taught her that her own judgment could not be relied upon, that the wall was not just protection against the world, but protection against herself. She told him she had never spoken it out loud to another living person. She told him she was no virgin, the words she had been rehearsing at the water pump, in the woodpile, and in the dark for 3 weeks. And she watched his face for the shift, the flattening of the eyes, the tightening of the jaw. the moment a person becomes a problem. Cade reached out and took her hand. Not with urgency, not with the particular careful gentleness that is really just another form of pity dressed in kinder clothes. He took her hand the way you take the hand of someone you are not going to let go of, and he looked at her. The two riders at the edge of the street looked at each other. Mae looked at Thorne directly for the last time, and what she felt was not triumph, not the hot, bright satisfaction she might have expected after 4 years of his offers, and his pressure, and his patience, and his carefully applied power. What she felt was something quieter and more complete than triumph. The feeling of a weight being set down after a very long carry. The feeling of solid ground under her feet. "Good afternoon, Mr. Thorne," she said. She turned her back on him and walked to the wagon. Behind her, she heard nothing for a long moment. Then she heard the sound of footsteps on the bank steps. Measured, controlled, retreating. She heard the creak of a carriage. She heard iron wheels on hard dirt, moving away down the street, growing fainter, and then gone. She did not look back. Cade fell into step beside her as she reached the wagon, and she felt his hand brush the back of hers. Not grabbing, not holding, just a brief point of contact that said everything it needed to say in the language they had been building between them for 3 weeks. She was safe. The land was hers. She had done it herself. Old Miller was waiting at the edge of the crowd. He was not a man given to demonstrations. He had lived on the south fence line for 30 years in a state of determined antagonism toward the world in general, and most of its inhabitants specifically. He did not wave or smile or offer the kind of public affirmation that costs nothing and means less. He raised his hat. Just once. A deliberate gesture from a man who had seen everything this particular stretch of country had to offer, and had decided on this particular afternoon that what he was looking at was worth acknowledging. Mae caught his eye and gave him a nod. It was enough. They drove back to the ranch in the last of the light. The cedar was at the mill. The receipt was in Mae's coat pocket next to the settled bank document, and the town of Redwood Flats was behind them, growing smaller in the distance the way things grow smaller when you have finished with them and turned your face towards something else. The road home ran through the pine country, the trees closing in on either side, the air cooling fast as the sun dropped below the ridgeline, and the shadows came out of the ground and spread across everything. Mae held the reins loosely. She was tired in a way that went all the way down. Not just the muscles, not just the 11 days of timber work and the sleepless night on the riverbank and the river crossing in the gray pre-dawn dark and the confrontation on the bank steps. All of that was in her body, yes, but underneath it was a deeper tiredness, the kind that comes when you have been braced for a blow for a very long time. And the blow has finally either landed or passed, and the muscles you were holding tight for all those months can finally, cautiously, begin to let go. The letting go was almost harder than the holding. She had not expected that. Cade did not speak for the first mile. He rode the second wagon with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything. The reins easy in his hands, his eyes on the road ahead. Mae was aware of him the way she had become aware of everything about him over the past 3 weeks. Not with the sharp, anxious vigilance of someone watching for a threat, but with a kind of peripheral warmth, the way you are aware of a fire in a room without needing to look directly at it to know it is there. The pines moved in the evening wind. An owl made one sound somewhere in the dark above the road and then went silent. "How does it feel?" Cade asked. Mae thought about the question seriously, the way it deserved to be thought about. "Like putting something down," she said. "Something I carried so long I forgot I was carrying it." Cade was quiet for a moment. "Good putting down or bad putting down?" "Good," she said. "Just strange. The way your arms feel light after you've been hauling all day and you finally stop." He nodded slowly, like that made complete sense to him, like he had his own version of that particular feeling stored somewhere, and recognized it immediately in her description. They drove on through the darkening pines. The ranch looked different when they came through the gate. Mae noticed it immediately, not because anything had changed, but because she was seeing it differently. The gate swung smooth on its oiled hinges. The yard was quiet and orderly in the particular way it had become orderly over the past 3 weeks, The wood stacked right, the tools put away in the right places, the small accumulated evidence of two people who had been paying attention to the same piece of ground at the same time. She pulled the wagon to a stop in the yard. For a moment, she just sat there looking at the cabin, the lamp in the window burning low, the way it always burned when she left it going in case she came back after dark. The front porch, with its creaking boards. The barn solid and familiar, smelling of hay and horses and the particular sweetness of cedar that had worked its way into everything over the past 11 days. She had been afraid of losing this for so long that she had sometimes forgotten to notice that she loved it. She let herself notice it now. They unharnessed the horses together, working in the familiar rhythm they had built without planning it, moving around each other in the barn with the unconscious coordination of two people who have spent enough hours in the same space to have learned each other's patterns. Mae worked the near horse while Cade took the far one. They brushed them down in the comfortable quiet that was its own kind of conversation. When the horses were settled and the barn was closed, they stood in the yard in the dark for a moment. The stars were out, a clear, dense spread of them across the sky above the tree line. The kind of sky you only get this far from town, where there is no competing light and the dark is genuinely dark. Mae stood with her head tipped back, looking at them, feeling the cool air on her face and the solid ground under her boots, and the fact of being exactly here, in this yard, on this land, with the deed settled and the debt gone, and the wall inside her chest lying in quiet pieces on the floor of a riverbank somewhere behind her. She heard Cade stop beside her. "Mae," he said. She lowered her head and looked at him. In the starlight, his face was all plains and shadows, but his eyes were clear. That particular steadiness in them that she had stopped trying to look away from. He was looking at her with the full, direct attention of a man who has something to say and has decided that now is the time to say it and is not going to dress it up or approach it sideways. "Back on the riverbank," he said, "when you told me," he paused. Not from uncertainty, more the pause of a man choosing his words with the care they deserved. "I want you to know that nothing you said changed anything about how I see you, except to make me see you more clearly." Mae held his eyes. "You already told me that," she said quietly. "I told you what your worth wasn't," he said. I didn't tell you what I see when I look at you." She waited. "I see the woman who walked a wagon across a flooded river ford in the dark because she found the way through when every other way had been taken from her," he said. "I see the woman who stood on the bank steps in front of the whole town and told the truth without raising her voice. I see," he stopped. Something moved across his face, not uncertainty, but the specific vulnerability of a person allowing themselves to want something out loud for the first time. "I see the first place in 3 years that has felt like somewhere I want to stop moving." Mae stood in the yard under the stars and felt the last of it. The last careful distance, the last reflex toward retreat, the last quiet voice in the back of her mind that said wanting this would cost her more than she could afford. Settle and go still. It did not disappear. She did not expect it to disappear. The things that happen to a person do not simply vacate the premises because something good has arrived to replace them. They stay. They become part of the architecture, but they do not have to be the load-bearing walls anymore. They do not have to be the thing the whole structure is built around. She had learned that on a riverbank, in the dark, with her hand in his. "I spent 7 years building walls," she said. Her voice was quiet and even, the voice of someone telling the truth without apology. "I got so good at it I started building them before I even knew what I was keeping out." She looked at him. "You're the first person I've let pass them in all the time. I need you to know that's not a small thing. For me, that is everything." Cade did not move toward her. He let the words stand in the air between them and gave them the room they deserved. And that particular restraint, that understanding that some things need a moment to simply exist before anything is added to them, was, Mae thought, the thing that had undone her most completely. Not the gate fixed in the first morning, not the grain trader, not the hand on her shoulder when Thorne came calling. This, the consistent, unhurried evidence of a man who understood that the most important things did not need to be rushed. "I know," he said, "and I need you to know that I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him for a long moment. Or then she stepped forward and closed the distance between them, and when she put her hand against his chest, she felt his heartbeat, faster than his stillness suggested, which told her something true about him that she filed away in the part of herself she was only now beginning to unlock. And she looked up at him and said the thing she had been working her way toward for 3 weeks without knowing it. "Stay," she said. "Not for the work, not for the land. Stay because this is where you belong." He put his hand over hers, warm and steady and certain. "I already decided that," he said, "on about day 3. Mae laughed. The real laugh, the one from below the chest, the one she had not known she still had until it came out by the creek 5 days ago. It came out again now, soft and genuine in the dark yard, and Cade smiled that full smile, and the lamp in the cabin window threw its steady light across the porch boards, and the pine trees moved in the night wind, and the ranch was quiet and whole, and entirely, unambiguously hers. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He did not say anything. Neither did she. There was nothing left that needed saying. 3 months is not a long time. In the life of a ranch, 3 months is barely a season. Not enough time to see the full turn of the land. Not enough time to know how the soil behaves in every kind of weather. Not enough time to understand all the ways a piece of ground will test you before it decides whether you belong on it. Mae knew this. She had been on this land long enough to understand that it gave up its secrets slowly and on its own schedule, and that the best thing a person could do was pay attention and be patient and not mistake a quiet stretch for a permanent condition. But 3 months was enough time to know that something had changed, not in the dramatic before and after way that stories sometimes suggest. Not a clean line between the old life and the new one, everything dark on one side and everything light on the other. Real change does not work like that. Real change works the way the land works, slowly from the ground up, in the small accumulations that you barely notice until one morning you step outside and realize that the thing you have been watching grow has grown, and the yard looks different, and the air feels different, and you are standing in a place that has become, without ceremony or announcement, something it was not before. Mae stood on the porch in the early morning and looked out over the ranch and felt that difference in her bones. The gate swung open on oiled hinges. She noticed it every morning, not because it was remarkable anymore, but because it had become part of the texture of the place, one of the small accumulated evidences of care that she had stopped having to do alone. The fence line on the north pasture was straight and tight for the first time in 2 years. The porch boards had been replaced, not all at once, but one at a time, as each one was identified and dealt with, the new wood bright against the weathered gray of the old. The well rope was new. The water cart wheel sat at the correct angle. The front porch had flowers on it, and that had been Mae's doing. She had planted them in the window boxes on a Saturday morning while Cade was working the south fence, and she had felt slightly ridiculous doing it, the way you feel slightly ridiculous doing something that announces, without ambiguity, that you intend to stay somewhere and make it beautiful. She had not planted flowers since before her father died. She had told herself there was no point. Flowers required water and attention, and everything she had was already going toward keeping the practical elements of the ranch alive. The truth was that flowers required hope, the specific long-term kind of hope that says, "I will be here to see these bloom. I believe in a future that includes this particular patch of ground looking the way I want it to look." She had not had that kind of hope for a very long time. She had it now. Cade came out of the barn while she was standing on the porch with her coffee. He was carrying a length of harness that needed mending, turning it over in his hands as he walked, assessing it with the same methodical attention he brought to everything. He looked up when he saw her on the porch, and something in his face did what it always did now when he looked at her, settled in the particular way of something that has found the place it was made for and knows it. He came and sat on the porch steps below her, the harness across his knees, and they stayed like that in the early morning quiet. Her standing with her coffee, him working the leather, neither of them talking because the quiet between them had long since stopped needing to be filled. A hawk moved across the sky above the tree line, riding something invisible, she tracing a long, slow arc over the dry red earth of Redwood Flats. Mae watched it until it was gone. She thought sometimes about the version of herself that had existed before Cade rode through the gate. Not with grief. She had done her grieving for that version of herself a long time ago, on a night that she did not need to revisit in detail to understand its full cost, but with a kind of clear-eyed acknowledgement of the distance traveled. That woman had been capable and strong and absolutely committed to the project of surviving on her own terms. And there was nothing wrong with her, nothing that needed to be fixed or apologized for. She had done what the circumstances required. She had built what needed to be built. She had kept the land and kept herself and kept going through 4 years of a solitude that had calcified, slowly and almost imperceptibly, into something she had started to mistake for preference. She had not preferred it. She had simply stopped being able to imagine anything else. What she understood now, standing on the porch in the early light with a man she trusted sitting on her steps, was that the things that happen to a person are not the things that define them. Not unless the person decides they are. Not unless the person hands over that particular authority to the worst moments of their history and lets those moments run the rest of the show. She had handed that authority over for 7 years. She had taken it back on a riverbank in the dark. Old Miller came by on a Tuesday afternoon, which was unusual. Miller did not make social calls. He did not believe in them on principle. He came by when he needed something practical, to discuss fence line boundaries or water rights or the occasional problem that required a neighbor's knowledge of the land. And he left again promptly, without the kind of extended pleasantries he considered a waste of both parties' time. He pulled up in his wagon, looked at the ranch, at the oiled gate, the straight fence line, and the flowers on the porch, with the expression of a man conducting a thorough inspection. Then he looked at Mae. Then he looked at Cade, who had come out of the barn when he heard the wagon. Then he looked back at Mae. "Holding up all right?" he said. It was from Miller, the equivalent of a lengthy and heartfelt speech. "Better than all right," Mae said. He gave a single nod, the same nod he had given Cade on the first morning, and the nod that meant he had assessed the situation and found it acceptable, which from Miller was as close to a blessing as anything was likely to get. He turned his wagon around and went home. Mae looked at Cade, who was watching the wagon go with an expression of quiet amusement. "High praise," he said. "Highest he gives," Mae said. That evening after supper, they sat on the porch steps as the sun went down over the flats. The light came in low and red, the way it always did at this hour, turning the dry earth the color of embers and the pine trees black against the sky. The air smelled of resin and dust and the faint sweetness of the flowers in the window boxes. Somewhere in the distance, something moved in the tree line, a deer probably, stepping out into the last of the light. Mae leaned back against the porch post and looked at the sky. She thought about the lamp. The lamp in the cabin window had been burning the same way for 4 years. A small, flickering light that she had kept going more out of habit than anything else, a signal to no one in particular, a refusal to sit entirely in the dark. She had not thought of it as anything more than that, a practical thing, a habit, but she thought about it differently now. She thought about the night she had sat across from Cade at that table, with her hands pressing into the wood, and her voice coming out thin as wire, and her whole body braced for the look she knew too well. She thought about the way the lamp had thrown more shadow than light, the flames shivering in the draft from the rattling shutters, the room feeling thick and still and suspended. She thought about how she had gone into that moment expecting it to end her. Instead, it had been the beginning. That was the thing about the lamp, she realized. It had been burning all along, not flickering with fear, as she had always read it, but steady with the simple, undemanding patience of a light that has decided to stay on regardless of whether anyone is coming home. It had been burning through the hard years and the lonely years, and the years of building walls so high she had almost forgotten what she was keeping out. It had been burning on the night Cade rode through her gate and looked at her like she was a person standing on her own dirt. It had never gone out. That was the part she had not understood until now, that the light had never gone out, that she had kept it burning without knowing she was doing it, and that somewhere underneath the wall, underneath the 7 years of careful self-containment and the calcified solitude and the practiced indifference to anything that might require her to want something she was afraid of losing, underneath all of it, she had been waiting, not for rescue. She had never needed rescuing. She had been waiting for someone to see the light and understand what it meant. Cade's shoulder was warm against hers in the cooling evening air. She looked at the cabin window where the lamp was burning. Stead,